It is just after midnight in Ottawa, and for the second time in 6 months, a 50% tariff has quietly kicked in on billions of dollars of Canadian goods. Hockey sticks, cement, beer, clothing, building materials. According to CBC News, the duties took effect at the stroke of midnight on the night of August 21st into August 22nd. Only hours after Prime Minister Mark Carney recalled his own negotiating team from the table and told the country he was walking away from what he called a bad deal. 3 days earlier, the President of the United States had posted on Truth Social that the two countries have a deal. 3 days later, that deal did not exist. Somewhere between those two moments, something broke, and what's left is one of the sharpest breakdowns in the entire 18-month trade war between Washington and Ottawa. This is the story of how it happened, what was actually on the table, who said what, and why two governments that insist they still want an agreement have just walked further apart than they've been in over a year. Let's start with what we can actually confirm happened, because there is a lot of noise around this story right now, and some of it is coming directly from the two governments involved, each trying to shape how the collapse gets remembered. According to Reuters and CNN Business, talks between Canadian and American negotiators had been running for nearly 2 weeks at a furious pace, following a decision by the Trump administration to delay the implementation of new 50% tariffs by 3 days, citing what officials called meaningful progress. On that Tuesday, Donald Trump told reporters, "We've come to a deal with Canada," though he immediately qualified it, adding that it was still subject to finalization of documents. The Canadian delegation, notably, did not use the same language. They were, according to Global News, considerably more cautious in how they described where things stood. By Wednesday, Bloomberg was reporting that American negotiators had tentatively agreed to lower existing tariffs on autos and metals from 25% down to 15%. A meaningful concession if it held. On Thursday, Canada's minister responsible for U.S. trade, Dominic LeBlanc, sat down for several hours with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer in what both sides later described as an intense marathon session. And then, by Friday night, it was over. Prime Minister Carney recalled the Canadian negotiating team back to Ottawa and addressed the nation directly, saying he was walking away from what he repeatedly called a bad deal. Here's the moment that hooks most of the coverage on this story. Within hours of that announcement, the 50% tariffs the U.S. had delayed went into effect anyway, hitting a specific and fairly unusual list of Canadian goods, hockey equipment among them, along with cement, clothing, building materials, and beer. Carney, speaking to reporters in Ottawa the next morning, called the tariffs a miscalculation. Then he laid out, in fairly blunt language for a sitting prime minister, exactly why he thought the deal fell apart. In recent days, the United States proposed new terms that were uneconomic, unfair, and undermined the net benefits for Canada, and called into question the reliability of any deal, Carney said, according to CNN and NBC News. In short, they asked too much, and they offered too little. To understand why that sentence landed the way it did in Ottawa, and why it's rippling through Canadian politics right now, you need the 18 months of history sitting underneath it, because this did not come out of nowhere. This is a trade war that has been building, stalling, restarting, and building again since the very first weeks of Donald Trump's second term. It began on February 1st, 2025, when Trump signed an executive order imposing tariffs on nearly all Canadian exports to the United States, 25% across the board, with a reduced 10% rate carved out for energy, critical minerals, and potash. According to CBC News, the administration justified the move by declaring a national emergency over undocumented immigration and drug trafficking across the northern border. An unusual legal basis, given how small a share of fentanyl entering the U.S. actually crosses from Canada compared to the southern border. At the time, Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister, and he promised retaliatory tariffs of his own. Canada's response eventually escalated to cover roughly $155 billion in American goods, according to Wikipedia's ongoing timeline of the trade war, compiled from public government notices and wire reporting. There was an early pause. Trump agreed to hold off for 30 days, and when tariffs did land on March 4th, they came in more limited than originally threatened, but the reprieve didn't last. Mark Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025, inheriting a fight that was still very much escalating. Just weeks into his term, Trump's sweeping 25% tariffs on auto imports took effect in April. Carney matched that rate almost immediately with his own tariff on non-USMCA compliant vehicles crossing north to south. Then in June, Washington's 50% tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum came into force, hitting Canadian producers directly. And Ottawa responded by threatening matching duties on American steel and aluminum starting in July, contingent on how the broader negotiations were going. Through the summer of 2025, there was a brief detour when Trump took aim at Canada's plans for a digital services tax targeting large tech firms. Carney eventually walked that policy back to keep talks alive, a decision some critics in Canada saw as a concession that bought very little goodwill. By late July and into August, Canada was facing an August 1st deadline to reach a deal or see its tariff rate jump from 25% to 35%. According to CBC's own timeline reporting, that deadline came and went without a resolution, and the higher rate landed on a range of Canadian goods. And that same period saw one of the more symbolically loaded moments of the entire dispute. In an Oval Office meeting in May 2025, with Carney standing beside him, Trump raised the idea of Canada becoming the 51st American state. A comment, Carney later told reporters, in French was simply not useful. The two leaders agreed, as Carney put it, to disagree on that point, but the phrase would resurface again and again over the following year, including in the events of just this past week. By October 2025, Carney and Trump were back at the White House for a joint press conference. And by the following weeks, Canada had cut some of its counter tariffs against both the U.S. and China in what was described at the time as an attempt to de-escalate. Around the same time, though, tensions flared again over an entirely different front. Canada, seeking to diversify away from total dependence on the American market, struck its own trade agreement with China, lowering tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for reduced Chinese import taxes on Canadian farm products. According to the Associated Press, Trump initially seemed to praise the move, saying at the time that it was a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. That praise did not last. Within about a week, Trump threatened a full 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Ottawa proceeded with the China deal, accusing Carney of trying to turn Canada into what he called a drop-off port for Chinese goods destined for the American market. China will eat Canada alive, Trump wrote in the Truth Social post, reported by the AP, completely devour it. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, pushed back, clarifying that Canada and China had resolved several important trade issues, but had not pursued anything close to a full free trade agreement. That accusation, that Canada is functioning as a backdoor for Chinese goods to reach American consumers, did not go away. It resurfaced explicitly again this week, and we'll get to that. Winter brought more friction. Trump threatened what he called very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer and potash in December 2025, prompting Saskatchewan's premier to publicly urge calm, telling reporters and cameras to take a breath. Around the same time, Canada's ambassador to Washington, Kirsten Hillman, stepped down, a departure that made headlines in its own right given the state of the relationship she'd been managing. Domestically, the trade war was also reshaping Canadian politics in ways that had little to do with Washington directly, feeding into fights over pipeline construction between Alberta, British Columbia, and Ottawa, and into a broader elbows-up political mood that conservative critics accused the Liberal government of abandoning whenever it made concessions to keep talks alive. Then, in early 2026, came a genuinely significant legal development that gets less attention than the political drama, but matters enormously to how this story plays out. According to Wikipedia's detailed timeline of the trade war, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down several of Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs, the ones imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, in a case brought by a toy and educational products company. That ruling didn't end the tariffs Canada was facing, many of which rested on different legal authority, including Section 338 of the U.S. Tariff Act of 1930, the provision Ottawa's own government statements point to for the most recent round. But it added legal uncertainty to the whole framework Trump had built his trade strategy on, and it's part of why both sides kept describing any deal, even the one that appeared close last week, as being about more than just tariff numbers. It was, in Carney's own words from his government's official statement, also about the reliability of any deal. That brings us into this summer and the specific run-up to last week's collapse. On August 18th, according to a statement posted directly to the Prime Minister of Canada's official website, Carney announced that after weeks of intensive discussions, the United States had agreed to postpone implementation of its 50% tariff under Section 338 until the end of day on August 21st. Substantial progress has been made, the statement read, although there's important work still to be done. That's about as close to optimistic as official government language gets in the middle of a trade dispute, and for a few days, it looked like it might hold. And respected. These conditions have not simply shifted. The climate has also changed. We cannot control the storm blowing in from Washington. He pointed to figures suggesting Canada's economy is currently creating jobs at 4 times the rate of the United States, and said the country is on track for the second fastest growth in the G7 over the next 2 years. $5 billion towards supporting Canadian workers and businesses hurt by the American tariffs, with a particular focus on small and medium-sized companies needing help with equipment, productivity upgrades, and supply chain resilience. He tied that spending to what he described as a broader national mood of quiet resolve. "We are vacationing in our national parks," he said, "buying Canadian products, choosing Canadian, small acts of solidarity repeated millions of times." Whether that consumer-level buy Canadian sentiment translates into measurable economic impact is genuinely contested, and not something this video can verify one way or the other. It's a political framing device as much as an economic claim, and it's worth hearing it that way. There's one more piece of underlying context that helps explain why this particular round of talks carried so much weight. The scheduled review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, the trade pact that replaced NAFTA, and that all three governments agreed to formally revisit in 2026. Early in his second term, Trump ordered the U.S. Commerce Department to study the impacts of that agreement and directed consultations to begin ahead of the review. According to Global News' own, it didn't hold. And when it broke, Carney gave one of the more detailed public accountings of a failed negotiation that either government has offered throughout this entire 18-month conflict. In formal remarks delivered from Ottawa, later published on the Prime Minister's official website, Carney explained that in this final round of talks, Canada's core objectives had been threefold: preserve tariff-free access to the U.S. market for the vast majority of Canadian businesses, provide greater long-term stability to the overall trade relationship, and significantly reduce American tariffs on Canada's key strategic sectors, namely autos, steel, and aluminum. According to CBC News, Carney told reporters directly that one of the main reasons he pulled out was because Washington's terms would destroy those very industries rather than protect them, the opposite of what Ottawa had gone into the room trying to secure. There were other sticking points too, and this is where the reporting gets more granular. Fox Business, citing details Carney provided at his Ottawa press conference, reported that American negotiators had also pushed for changes touching Canada's protections around its culture and the French language, provisions Ottawa was not willing to accept under any circumstances. Global News, meanwhile, reported that the 11th hour disagreements centered specifically on how to tariff the auto sector and on broader questions of what Carney's government described as Canada's right to make independent domestic decisions, including which countries it can pursue trade agreements with. That's a direct echo of the China dispute from the fall, resurfacing inside the very talks meant to resolve the broader relationship. What did Canada actually offer in return? According to CNN, Ottawa had put forward real concessions as part of a potential deal, removing its retaliatory tariffs that had been in place since 2025, and, notably, encouraging Canadian provinces to put American alcohol products back on store shelves, something several provinces had banned in direct retaliation for earlier rounds of U.S. tariffs. Carney had reportedly shared details of the emerging deal with Canada's premiers earlier in the week, asking them to prepare to reverse those alcohol bans if an agreement came together. It didn't come together, and as of this recording, those provincial bans remain in place in most of the country. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer offered his own account of what went wrong, posting early Saturday, and reported by CNN that Canada declined to finalize the trade deal under the terms agreed earlier this week. Greer said that agreement, as the Americans understood it, included significant tariff reductions on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, alongside what he called a historic economic and national security partnership. Greer also pointed specifically at Canada's continued retaliatory measures, including what he described as flat-out prohibitions on certain American goods and services, a clear reference to those provincial alcohol bans, as a genuine point of friction from the American side. So you have two governments, both saying they made real concessions, both saying the other side moved the goalposts at the very last moment. That's not spin layered on top of the facts. That's actually where the verified public record currently sits, and it's worth being honest about that rather than picking a side for you. What happened next? Moved fast. With those 50% tariffs now in effect on that specific list of goods, hockey equipment, cement, clothing, building materials, and beer, Carney announced Canada's retaliation. Canada will match those tariffs dollar for dollar, he told reporters, according to NBC News. Those Canadian countermeasures are set to take effect on September 8th and will apply to steel, dairy products, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp, paper, and electronics, according to CNN's reporting on the retaliatory list Ottawa published. When a reporter asked Carney at that Ottawa press conference why it felt like he was going to war with the United States, his answer was blunt: because we were attacked. Overnight, Donald Trump responded on Truth Social with a post that's been widely quoted since. Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one. he wrote, adding a separate claim that Canada had for years charged American farmers massive amounts of tariffs, closing with "no more." The White House, according to both CNN and NBC, did not respond to press requests for further comment or clarification beyond that post. By Monday, Carney was speaking to reporters again, this time in Lévis, Quebec, offering a slightly more measured retrospective account of the collapse. "We did make some progress in recent weeks," he said, according to CBC News. "In the end, that momentum reversed, and we could not accept what the U.S. had offered, nor could we give what they asked. It's a quieter line than 'we were attacked,' but it lands just as firmly. This was, in Carney's telling, a deliberate choice to walk away rather than sign something Ottawa judged to be worse than no deal at all." That same Monday, Vice President J.D. Vance offered the American side's most detailed public response yet, speaking to an audience in Brewer, Maine, at a manufacturing facility, according to Spectrum News, Fox News, and CP24. "They came in with a bunch of unreasonable last-minute demands," Vance said. "I frankly thought we had a deal. I think that we should have a deal, but I think that we need to send a message loud and clear to the Prime Minister of Canada. Stop taking advantage of the people of Maine. Stop taking advantage of America. It's over. We expect fairness in our trade policy." At another point in the same appearance, discussing the tensions, Vance referred to Canada as a state, then quickly caught himself. "Sorry, Freudian slip," he said as the crowd laughed. "That was actually an accident," he added, though the moment was clipped and circulated widely within hours. Vance went further on specifics, according to Fox News, pointing to dairy as a concrete grievance. "If a Maine farmer sends dairy products into Canada, they could be paying as much as a 250% tariff," Vance told the crowd. "Now, how is it fair to the farmers of Maine that they pay 250% when the Canadian farmers pay nothing?" That figure reflects Canada's tariff rate quota system for dairy, where imports beyond a set volume face steep duties, a structure that predates this entire trade war by decades and is tied to Canada's long-standing supply management system for its dairy industry. Vance also revived the accusation from last fall, telling the Maine audience that Canada allows itself to be what he called a backdoor for Chinese goods, ultimately destined for the American market, a direct callback to the China trade deal dispute from October. Back in Ottawa, the political fallout from the collapse has been immediate and, in some ways, more complicated than a simple government versus opposition story. According to CP24's live coverage of the aftermath, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has been publicly demanding that Carney release the full details of the proposed deal that fell through, pressure the government has so far resisted. Green Party leader Elizabeth May took a somewhat different position, calling for opposition party leaders to at least be briefed on where things stand, saying, "I think we should have at least a Zoom call or Teams meeting as we used to do under the former Prime Minister to make sure that we are all updated," though she stopped short of demanding the details be made fully public. Political analyst Laurie Turnbull, a professor at Dalhousie University, told CTV News Channel that she wasn't surprised Poilievre was pushing for disclosure, but doubted it would happen. "I don't think he's going to say anything that he doesn't want to say about this," Turnbull said of Carney. "I think if he's been guarded about what the exact terms were, it is for a reason." Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew took a more combative public tone earlier in the dispute, saying the federal government should simply fight the Trump administration rather than continue making concessions, a sentiment that appears, at least for now, to be closer to where Ottawa has actually landed. In his formal remarks explaining the walkaway, published on the Prime Minister's official website, Carney tried to frame the moment as part of a longer arc rather than a single crisis. "For much of our history, Canadians have been able to count on favorable trade conditions," he said, "a stable relationship with the United States, increasingly open access to the U.S. market, and rules that both countries understood timeline reporting from January 2025. That review clock has been running in the background of every tariff threat and every negotiating round since, because CUSMA is the legal framework that still, technically, guarantees tariff-free trade on the vast majority of goods crossing the Canada-U.S. border, even while both governments have layered emergency and sectoral tariffs on top of it. A collapsed side deal on autos and steel doesn't automatically unravel CUSMA itself, but it does raise the stakes for how that broader review goes, and it gives both Ottawa and Washington real incentive to project strength now, before the larger structural negotiation over the whole agreement gets underway. Canadian officials have repeatedly pointed to CUSMA as the basis for a broader negotiation, in Carney's own words from an earlier White House visit, and that framing hasn't gone away even as this specific round of side talks fell apart. It's also worth noting how unusual it is, even by this trade war's own standard, for a list of tariffed goods to look the way this one does. Hockey equipment, cement, beer, clothing, and building materials aren't the sectors that typically dominate Canada-U. S, trade disputes. Autos, steel, aluminum, and energy usually take that spotlight. According to trade analysts, cited by CBC and Global News, the specificity of this particular 50% tariff list invoked under Section 338 of the nearly century-old U.S. Tariff Act of 1930, rather than the Emergency Powers Law. The Supreme Court, partially struck down earlier this year, suggests the Trump administration deliberately chose a narrower, more legally durable tool this time, one less likely to face the kind of court challenge that undercut its earlier tariff actions. That legal caution, choosing a slower, more targeted list instead of another sweeping emergency order, is itself a signal of how much the Supreme Court's ruling on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act reshaped the administration's tariff strategy heading into this latest confrontation with Ottawa. So where does that leave things heading into September? On the record, both governments say they still want a deal. Vance told his main audience that negotiations with Canada are, in his words, ongoing. Carney has said compromise remains possible, even as he defends the decision to walk away from what was on the table last Friday. But the concrete facts on the ground right now point the other direction. 50% American tariffs are in effect on hockey equipment, cement, clothing, building materials, and beer. Canada's matching 50% retaliatory tariffs on steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp, paper, and electronics are scheduled to take effect September 8th. The provincial bans on American alcohol, which Carney had offered to help unwind as part of the failed deal, remain in place across most of the country, and the underlying disagreements over auto tariffs, over Canada's trade relationship with China, over cultural and language protections, and now openly over the question of Canadian sovereignty itself, are all still sitting on the table, unresolved. Before we go further, it's worth being upfront about where the verified information in this story comes from, and where the genuine uncertainty still lies, because that distinction matters more than usual on a story moving this fast. The timeline of tariffs and the sequence of the past week's collapse is drawn from CBC News, CNN Business, NBC News, Global News, Reuters, the Associated Press, Fox News, Fox Business, and CP24, along with statements published directly on the Prime Minister of Canada's official government website. Direct quotes from Carney, Greer, and Vance come from those same named outlets and from official government statements, not from anonymous sources or secondhand paraphrase. What remains genuinely contested is the exact substance of the deal that fell apart. Ottawa has not released the full terms publicly. Washington's characterization through Greer's statement differs in emphasis from Carney's account of what was demanded, and no independent, neutral third party has confirmed precisely which version of the final offer is most accurate. Any claim about what really happened inside that room, beyond what both governments have chosen to say on the record, should be treated as unverified for now. If you've been tracking this trade war since it started back in February 2025, you already know how many times it's looked like a deal was close before falling apart again, and how many times a temporary pause has turned into another round of escalation just weeks later. If you want to actually follow where this goes next, whether the September 8th retaliatory tariffs hold, whether talks genuinely restart, or whether this becomes the deepest rupture yet between two of the world's most historically integrated economies, it's worth staying subscribed, because this story is nowhere near finished. What's genuinely striking about this particular breakdown, compared to earlier ones in 2025, is the tone. Earlier collapses in this trade war tended to come with both sides still speaking carefully, leaving room to walk things back. This one has a different texture. Carney's language, "We were attacked." Vance's, "It's over." Trump's, "Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one." None of that reads like language designed to preserve room for a quiet, face-saving return to the table next month. It reads like two governments that have concluded, at least for now, that public toughness matters more than diplomatic softness, whatever the private calculus behind that decision actually is. That raises the harder, longer-term question sitting underneath all of this. What does Canada actually do if this relationship doesn't repair itself in any reasonable time frame? The China trade deal from last fall, however limited in scope, was one early signal that Ottawa is at least testing what diversification away from total U.S. dependence could look like. Carney's own government statement pointed to existing free trade agreements giving Canada preferential access to 1.5 billion consumers worldwide, with a stated goal of doubling that market access by the end of this year, though, again, that's a government target, not a confirmed outcome. Whether that kind of diversification can realistically offset the sheer scale of Canada's economic integration with the United States, built up over decades under NAFTA and then CUSMA, is a genuinely open debate among trade economists, and this video isn't going to pretend there's a settled answer to it. And what we can say with confidence is this. As of today, there is no active trade deal between Canada and the United States. There are instead competing 50% tariffs on both sides of the border, a prime minister in Ottawa who has publicly staked his credibility on having walked away from a bad deal rather than signed one, and a vice president in Washington accusing that same prime minister of bad faith on live television, all playing out while ordinary businesses on both sides of the border, from Ontario auto plants to Maine dairy farms, absorb the actual financial cost of a dispute they didn't create and don't control. If you want a deeper breakdown, the moment either side blinks, whether that's a walked-back tariff, a surprise phone call between Carney and Trump, or a full return to the negotiating table before September 8th, that's exactly the kind of fast-moving development this channel exists to track, and subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss the moment it happens. There's also a domestic Canadian political story worth watching closely here, separate from the Washington drama. Carney came into office in March 2025 largely on the strength of positioning himself as the leader best equipped to stand up to Trump, in contrast to what critics characterized as a more conciliatory approach under his predecessor. Walking away from a deal, and being seen to walk away from a deal, plays directly into that political identity. But it's also a genuine gamble. If the retaliatory tariffs, set for September 8th, cause visible economic pain in the coming weeks, particularly in export-dependent provinces, the political pressure to return to the table on worse terms than what was reportedly on offer last Friday could build quickly. Poilievre's Conservatives are already positioning to make that argument, pushing for a transparency on the failed deal's terms precisely so they can judge, in public, whether walking away was actually the stronger move or a costly miscalculation of Carney's own. There's a reason both sides are fighting so hard over how this moment gets remembered. In a trade relationship this large, worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, and touching everything from auto manufacturing in Ontario to dairy farming in Wisconsin and Maine, from steel plants in Hamilton to lumber mills in British Columbia, the political narrative around a breakdown can matter almost as much as the tariff numbers themselves. Whoever is seen, domestically, as the reasonable party that walked away from an unfair deal gets to hold the moral high ground going into whatever negotiation comes next. Whoever is seen as the one who blew up a workable agreement over last-minute demands takes the political hit. Right now, both governments are actively fighting for that framing, in real time, in front of cameras, which is part of why the public statements from Carney, Greer, Vance, and Trump have all landed within days of each other, rather than being quietly worked out behind closed doors first. For businesses caught in the middle, none of that framing matters nearly as much as the actual tariff schedule. Ontario's ArcelorMittal Dofasco steel plant in Hamilton, for instance, sits directly in the path of these disputes, its rolled steel coils now facing yet another round of uncertainty over what tariff rate will actually apply to cross-border shipments come September. Auto manufacturers on both sides of the border have spent the better part of 2 years trying to plan supply chains around tariff rates that keep shifting every few months. First 25%, then a proposed cut to 15% that never got finalized. Now back to 50% on a narrower set of goods with broader sectoral tariffs still technically in place from earlier in the year. That whiplash, more than any single tariff number, is what trade economists and business groups on both sides of the border have repeatedly flagged as the deeper economic cost of this entire 18-month conflict. Not just the tariffs themselves, but the impossibility of planning around a relationship that keeps almost getting resolved and then doesn't. So here's where we actually land, as of this recording. A deal that both leaders publicly described as close, even done, 3 days before it collapsed, is now dead, at least in its previous form. Retaliatory tariffs are scheduled and confirmed for September 8th. Provincial alcohol bans remain in place. The core disagreements over autos, sovereignty, culture, and China have not gone away. They've simply resurfaced in sharper language than before. And two governments that both insist they still want an agreement are, for the moment, talking mostly through press conferences and Truth Social posts, rather than across a negotiating table. Whether that changes before September 8th, or whether this becomes the new normal for Canada-U.S. Trade heading into the fall genuinely isn't something anyone can verify or predict with confidence right now, and this video isn't going to pretend otherwise. What we do know is that Ottawa has made its position clear, publicly and repeatedly, that it would rather absorb short-term tariff pain than sign what Carney has called a bad deal. Whether that turns out to be the right long-term bet for Canada, or a costly miscalculation that gets renegotiated on worse terms in a few months, is a question only time and the next round of talks will actually answer. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. Was Carney right to walk away from this deal, even knowing it meant an immediate 50% tariff hit on Canadian goods? Or should Ottawa have taken whatever terms were on the table just to end the uncertainty? Let us know where you land in the comments, and if you want to be there the moment this story moves again, that subscribe button is exactly how you'll catch it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.